All right. Hey, Kenzie. Thanks for being here.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
Well, I'm excited to connect. I would love to hear the Kenzie Barlow one pager. What
Oh,
brought you to running, and what are you doing in the sport today?
all right. So I always like to tell people that I don't come from a traditional background in the sense that if you were to look at maybe if you had come across my social media page, you might see someone that seems like they're very well immersed in the mountain running world. And while I do consider that a huge part of my lifestyle now, it's not something I would have seen myself doing maybe even, gosh, like 12 years ago. So I don't know if I'd consider it unconventional or not, but I didn't run track and field in high school. I was not a collegiate athlete. I actually spent the early part of my 20s gestating, raising babies. So really, if you would have asked me in my early 20s what you thought I would be doing now at 40 and seeing what I'm doing, I would have told you to get lost. I would not have believed it. But I think what really brought me to it was after I had had my third child, I really just was looking for a hobby. Kind of like realizing that there was not like when I had a little bit of me time, I don't feel like I knew really what to do with myself. And, I was maybe a little concerned about like getting back into shape post having babies, but more so I just needed like an outlet, like something to alleviate like, a lot of the emotional stress that happens at those times of life. And so it just happened that some friends invited me to join in one of their, I don't know if you've heard of the Ragnar Trail. Well, it actually wasn't trail. It was just the Ragnar race series. So it's like a team event, and you kind of like rotate through different legs of that. And it was the first time I'd heard about it, but decided to jump in on that. And I really had not been running at all. Like I knew nothing about running. So it was more so about this idea of having a goal to motivate me, and just started training, not knowing anything really about like actual training adaptation or what I should be doing. So what it looked like was me running on a treadmill across the street at my gym while I had a baby in a car carrier, and just kind of like working my way from there. So what I found through that was that I really have this personality. I just kind of feel like maybe it was dormant, or I didn't have like the right like life stimulus to realize that I really thrive on having goals to motivate me, and even like taking the little micro wins, but like taking these little processes a little bit at a time, and eventually whittling your way to something that seems really big and scary. So that was really where it started. It was like these little races with friends worked up to the half marathon, maybe where it kind of the trail diverged to like something more unconventional is a friend of mine who was kind of on a similar journey. We were like training friends, training partners. We both had come across this 50-mile race. Now this was all road, all pavement, 50-mile race. At the time, I didn't realize how unusual that is. I mean, we both had completed our first marathon, and we are kind of looking for that next big thing. And instead of just being like normal people and being like, oh, let's just do another marathon or try to do that marathon faster, we were like, let's try to do this 50-mile all pavement race. And so we both did that. It was a very interesting experience. But what I found through that was that I really enjoyed the process of not just running, like, the actual art of running, but the places that I ran really, really spoke to me. It was just like over some mountain passes, all on road. Paid a heavy price with my feet on that one, not training the right way. But I just found that I love being in nature, and I love the feeling of having an able body moving through nature in that way. And so I kind of just gravitated, I guess, to make a long story short, kind of gravitated from there to trail and ultra running, and that's really where my heart has been set for the last 8 to 9 years. So
It's amazing how a friend inviting you to go do some race is such a gateway drug. And
isn't
now
it
look at you.
wild? I mean, just one, and I think about that a lot, like just how sometimes one uncomfortable decision can literally change your trajectory in life. And I would say that is, as dramatic as that sounds, it has literally been a very much a life changing decision for me. So
Yeah, I mean, I have a very similar sort of origin story in that I started running cross country because I thought I could high jump because cross country is like track, right?
Right, right.
And no, I quickly learned there's no high jumping in cross country. It's all running. But it's amazing how that one little decision, even though it was a mistake, led me on my path, and here I am today.
Right.
Now, you mentioned that you're not like a normal person who might just want to do another marathon or try to go faster. Talk to me about that because that's very interesting to me. Most people don't run some races and then all of a sudden want to do trail ultra marathons. They want to,
Yeah.
maybe stick to the road, maybe get better at the events that they had tried. What was the allure of these very long, admittedly beautiful trail races?
Gosh. Yeah, great question. Okay. Let's see. I think it started with the mindset where you know, people could say, well, what is normal? Who's normal? And I guess that's a fair point too. I would say what I would define as not normal is I do feel like one of my superpowers, and again, this was not something that I would have considered an attribute I even knew that I had in me until I started exploring that through running, was that I really love being uncomfortable. And I think it's for me it's more like it's less about the physical discomfort, but more about what I learn about myself through physical discomfort. So it's kind of this exploration process of of who I am as a person through these longer, I call them these like our mountain journeys. And so, um, and I do feel like that's maybe a little bit different than a lot of people. I feel like, like running with different athletes and coaching different athletes, like everybody has different drives of why they pursue the goals that they have. And I can definitely say that mine have a lot more to do with the idea of self mastery than anything. I mean, I definitely appreciate the again like the scientific side behind like adaptation and what's the human body's capable of with the right and different stimuluses, but um, I feel like that's kind of why I landed in the area that I'm at now, because I feel like these long, and when I say long, I mean what I really love doing. My favorite distance would be the 100-mile distance, um, but you know anything from 50K to 100K, I guess technically is considered a trail ultra race. But I think I like the longer distances because I feel like it's my husband has kind of described this to me, and I agree with him. He also does the same similar events, but it's kind of like you have like this mini life, like it's like microcosm in life in one race because you're out there for so long. There's so many highs and lows, and I mean maybe unlike even like a 5K or even a marathon where it's really 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 uncomfortable. In fact, I you just posted something about 5K being harder or as hard as a marathon, and I thought that I was like that's spot on because it's a type of suffering I'm not very good at. That really intense suffering for a short amount of time. What I'm really good at is being really really uncomfortable for a long period of time. So that long suffering idea, and I feel like that, I wouldn't say I've mastered that, but it's something that I'm still really curious about exploring what I'm capable of at. So in those longer distances, there is a lot of time to really go into those dark places in your head and sit in there for a long time, and nobody likes to be there. I don't think it's a very very uncomfortable place to be. I'd say that's kind of like where a lot of your own demons come out. And I before I got to get into like the longer stuff, I did, I would say, dabble for a few years in the road running scene. And so it was like, the duration of a race would be, depending on it, up to maybe 4 hours. um, and you can talk yourself into being really pretty miserable at a higher intensity for 4 hours, but when all of a sudden, I still remember the first 100 miler I did was, it was ironically a race that happens to be right in my backyard, which is the Wasatch 100. And so one of the benefits of that is that I was pretty familiar with the first part of the course because the start line happens to be 10 minutes from my house. And so I had been up on those mountains many times in different, sometimes with training, but sometimes, up there on a razor, like in my younger years or something. So I was kind of familiar with it, but I still remember getting up. You start on this really long, heinous climb up what's called Bear Canyon, and you kind of top out. Once you get up there, and that's maybe mile 10, You kind of run along a ridge for about 5 miles, but along that ridge, it's amazing, but you can see forever and ever. And what you also can see is about where the finish line is going to be. And it's like mountain vista after mountain vista away. And that's pretty intimidating. The first time I really kind of realized visually like where I was asking my body to go, it just seemed like another continent. And so that was like the first opportunity to just really freak out. Like, this is what I'm asking myself. Am I capable of doing this? And but it was also like a good time to like work on these mental things. Like, okay, it's just take a little bit at a time, and that's kind of what it became. Was like one aid station at a time. So I've learned a lot over the years of doing it. I say I'm good at some things, and there's some things I realize are my weaknesses, but that's definitely where I still feel like I have a hard time ever thinking I'll ever be satisfied with exploring that.
I think that the 100-mile trail distance, that kind of an event is almost a different sport than, say, a road or track 5K. It is so different and requires such a different skill set, both physically and mentally, that it makes complete sense to me that you're all in on these long ultra distances. But yeah, the short stuff you're just not really into.
Not everybody does, but that's refreshing to hear. But yeah,
Yeah, it's a totally different sport. So it's like, hey, why does someone like basketball over baseball? Well,
sure.
personal preference.
Right.
And I don't really see these distances having too much in common. Obviously fitness is fitness. If you're a good runner at one, you're probably going to be a decent runner at the other with the right training. But man, they're so different. They are so different.
Wildly different. I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Now, Kenzie, speaking of suffering, I want to talk about this injury that you're dealing with. And I believe you are currently dealing with it. It's an injury that you described as a congenital back anomaly. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, that's a mouthful, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. So I guess the better way to put it, from as much information as I've tried to dive into it, is it's not necessarily an injury per se. In that, from what from all of the experts I've been to, it's not really an injury that heals. It can heal, but the best way I can describe it in layman's terms is that when you're born, you are born with these growth plates, and as you grow, you have to have room for growth. So all of these are movable, and they're not all fixed together. But somewhere during puberty, they start to fuse together. Um, One of mine, I think between my L5 and my L6 vertebrae, didn't fully fuse together. So that's why it's called transitional. Is it's a partial fusion of two vertebrae. So and again, so that's not really an injury. It's just something that happens, and apparently it's actually quite common. From what I've heard, I think what I remember is that maybe like 1 in 10 people have it. So not uncommon. It's just how many people use their bodies enough to a point where, or push their bodies to a point where it becomes a problem. So really the nature of the problem, or I guess the limiter on my end, I guess, is inflammation. So that's kind of where I've sat. The wild part about it, I guess, that maybe I'd say has been kind of frustrating, and I have made peace with it to some degree, but it really didn't become a problem until, so I ran my first 100-mile race in 2014. And it was after that race, maybe about a month later, I just kind of started noticing that I had hip pain. It was like manifesting in my hip. So I finally got to a point where I went saw a doctor. It was diagnosed actually as a hip impingement, and was told that I'd likely need to go have the surgery where you shave down and kind of reshape your hip so that it's not catching. And but before, of course, they do the surgery, he wanted to have the MRI done to make sure everything was what he was expecting. So they MRI'd my hip. The big blessing was that it happened to also catch in the MRI the lower part of my back. So when I went in, it was quite surprising for them to say, well, it's not your hip at all. It's actually your back, and this is what's going on. So in 2015, and it kind of depends on the doctors you go to, but in 2015, I was pretty much told by that doctor, you're really not genetically set up to be a runner, especially the type of running that you want to do. So it's really up to you. It's kind of going to just be like an inflammation slash pain management problem on your end. But from what it's looking like, I mean, this was again like really, I had only had one solid year of true ultra running training under my belt. So when I was told that that was likely not going to be my future, I was a really sad and depressing prospect, because here you like finally find what you feel like is like your thing, and like where you feel like you belong, and then you're told that your body doesn't want to go where your mind wants it to go. So took a cortisone shot at the time to manage inflammation, and fully kind of at the time working through trying to accept like that likely I would not be doing ultra running from there on out. But magically I didn't have any issues, and from 2015 to about 2018 I was definitely training the highest volumes that I ever have. Had the best success I had in races. I would say was a non-issue. I was also, and I'm sure at some point we'll maybe talk about this, but I was have always been a big fan of weight training and cross training. So I had always had that in my background, and I kind of, and my doctor even told me like he attributed like you're going to have to do a really good job of keeping a strong core as a runner, because if you can keep a strong core, you'll likely avoid all of the extra movement and that's in play in your lower back, and so you'll probably avoid some of the friction that's going on while you're running. And so I did a really good job of maintaining that for years and had no issues until about 2020. I think because the world was falling apart, I felt like kind of so was my body, and I don't know if that's just partially a product of aging. I hate to say that because I still don't consider myself very old, and I still feel like there's very much a lot of longevity in these ultra distance sports, even well into your 40s, 50s. So I'm just kind of playing around with what's going to work for me. I definitely wouldn't say it's been detrimental. It's changed the way that I've had to, I guess, adjust my expectations of what I want to get out of the sport. And that's been a couple of years of trial and error. But I would still say, lucky for me, I have been able to enjoy a few years of really amazing, like bucket filling running. It's shifted a little less from like, I guess I'd say competitive, but really like aggressive training to where I was trying to like toe the line for a PR attempt at a race. That hasn't been able to happen for a few years, but I have managed to have some of the most amazing dream runs of adventures and things like that for the last couple of years, and it's definitely kept me very happy.
It sounds like you don't really have too many limitations on your running because of your back issues. Is it just like something where you have to keep on top of strength training, and besides that, just use some common sense?
Um, Common sense is always a great foundation, right? I would say it's again been trial and error, because I'm trying to find out like what changed from those first couple of years after my initial diagnosis, where I was able to withstand, a lot of different training than I am now. And when I started trying to get back, I'll kind of throw in a side note that in 2018, our family moved out of the country and lived in Ireland for a year. And so my running goals had to kind of get put on the back burner while we just focused on the experience of living abroad. And we definitely ran there, but it kind of put me out of my mojo of structured training. And so coming back from that and trying to like reintroduce structure just has been a little bit difficult, like because now I was no longer trying to maintain a fitness level that I had for years. I was trying to rebuild that. So I think what I have learned is that the problem for me is more back-to-back volumes, which is hard again because we're talking about ultra distance racing. And so kind of my pattern is that I could go out right now. And in fact, we just went to Ireland, and I was able to enjoy some fun runs and reconnect with friends and do some kind of just fun nostalgic runs out there. And so, we did some couple 4+ hour mountain runs, 16+ miles out there, and I seem to be okay. But it's like the day after I do those runs, things are hurting pretty bad. Like I'm getting like the weird zinger down my leg, and again, lucky for me, those aren't necessarily according to years of meeting with different doctors, those aren't signs of like an injury and my body telling me I need to stop. It's just telling me we've got a lot of inflammation going on right now and you need to settle down or else just learn to deal with weird zingers going down your leg. And if I just ignore those, it would get to a point, I've tried this for years, like would get to a point where I do like a, a long training run on a Friday and then turn around and try to do another long training run on Saturday. And it would get to where it was like the inflammation was so bad, or I'd start getting like drop foot and I would start tripping over rocks, and just the potential for injury on those kind of things weren't as exciting. So it's kind of that idea of like, of learning. Maybe it's like I'm learning is what I'd say, kind of moving into a more seasoned athlete approach of realizing that making good choices or even just being tough and being mentally tough, which again is like what I like thrive on, isn't always just about like pushing through things no matter what, but educating myself about what's going on in my body and making decisions about what is really worth it. I don't feel like I'm again re-injuring anything, but there is always that side in like I like to run, like I love technical terrain. That's always been one of my strengths. And so like a really technical downhill has always been I love doing that. But if I'm dealing with like a weird drop leg and all of a sudden the muscles aren't firing the way that I expect them to, and I trip on a rock and go yard sail it down, like that's no longer a risk worth taking for me anymore, because I would rather focus on the longevity of the sport versus the intensity.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm sure, Kenzie, that, for more than a decade, you've identified as a runner, a trail runner, a mountain athlete, an ultra marathoner. How does something like this affect, how you think of yourself? Have you ever, doubted your abilities or your career in the sport because of this? It seems like
Yeah,
such a hard thing to grapple with.
for sure. Now we're getting deep. Yeah. Oh, geez. I'd say yeah. It's again, it's I don't know if it's like this for everybody, but I kind of feel like to some degree I did a little bit of my life in reverse, where maybe a lot of people spend their early 20s kind of exploring like who they are, what they want to be in the world, what they have to offer, and not that I did it wrong, I just did it different. I started by having my kids young and focusing on my family young. So all of a sudden, when I got to the point where kids don't necessarily need as much of your time and you do have a little bit of extra emotional energy to invest in, like, what is my identity, what do I offer the world besides raising kids and taking care of other people's immediate well-being. And I kind of had a freak out moment. That was part of maybe what also timing wise led me down the journey that I've gone down. So I do feel like in my adult life, running has been a massive part of my identity. And I think I've always been aware of like trying to be careful of not having too much of my self-worth tied up in what I'm physically capable of. I'm always aware that there's pitfalls with that, right? Like if you get injured or something takes you out, and then that could be a really depressing potential. But for a couple of years, it was really hard, and I think part of that is admittedly ego driven, where when I got into it, I found a lot of success in the early part of it. Like, and it's like this, like with coaching with training stimulus, when you first get into it, like you introduce just a little bit of training stimulus and you get a lot of return for that investment pretty quick. So it's pretty exciting. And even to so when I started training and got more serious in amount of training and adding volume and doing more mountainous things, I was seeing a lot of success with that. And so of course that like feeds the ego of well, look at me and look what I can do. And all that's really exciting. And people start acknowledging you for, oh, that's Kenzie, the ultra trail runner. And, you add even the layers of social media and all those silly things on top of that, definitely it's really hard to not get caught up in that becomes your identity or what you offer the world based on what you do in your performance. And so there was that going on. But then at the same time, I think I kind of got into trail running. I kind of joke because it's definitely gotten more popular. I was hesitate to say it's become mainstream, but I think in the last 4 to 5 years, it has definitely become more popular in the sense that you're now seeing a lot more like collegiate level athletes that are transitioning into trail and ultra, where you didn't see a lot of that before, like, or elite marathoners that decide that they're going to start transitioning into trail running or whatever. And so, back when I was just kind of started getting into it, it was like, yeah, 28 to 30-year-old Kenzie that's a mom of three and fits in the training wherever she can, but is pretty fit and likes to be super mentally tough, can go out and have a pretty good race and also plays pretty well within the event. But as you start aging, and so you're aging and trying to ask your body of those same demands that it did when it was younger, or also not maybe necessarily as injured or realized what was going on. You also now have younger people coming in and competing in the same categories, right? Like there's no pro division in trail running. And so that was kind of a check for me to start realizing, like, am I even relevant anymore if I go and try to toe the line of a 100-mile race and I don't place in the top 5 people or something. And so that, and then you layer on again, like the expectations with my back, like, so I think it's been a kind of a forced thing for me to really do some reflecting over the last couple of years. Like, what do I really, really value in this sport? Does it have more to do with how other people view me in the sport? Or is it truly like fulfilling, independent? Like, if nobody else knew that I was going out and doing this race, would I still be getting the same experience out of it? Does that make sense? In fact, I have a good story about that. If you want me to tell you about my last, so my last 100-mile. This maybe makes me. This is a little vulnerable, I would say, but for the sake of being honest. So the last time I toed the start line of a 100-mile race was in 2019. So it was the year I moved back from Ireland, and I had decided at the time, like, oh, this is like my triumphant return back to like structured training. And I wrote myself a training plan and I was nailing the whole thing. And I had signed up for the Bighorn 100 and like with the goal of I was going to podium at this race. And I had been doing really well. Like all of like the feedback I was getting in my training and everything. I mean, I definitely would consider myself at like pretty close to the fittest I feel like I've ever been. So confidence in my physical ability was definitely there. There was other things going on in the background of my life, like with, again, like you can't ignore in the scope of an athlete. Like, and I say this to my own athletes that I coach, that I my philosophy is that people are people first and athletes second. That maybe sounds like really obvious, but if you really dive into it, that's the reality, is that running is something that we pursue, but it isn't necessarily the thing that defines us or our priority. We have to do our best. Every athlete's different, right? Like what their expectations are. But in my case, I'm a mom first, and I, hold up a lot of different commitments in the community and things. And so there's a lot going on in the background. But in the meantime, I was definitely making this work, and I felt like I was ready to toe that start line, like to nail it. I was out for what? Some stuff happened the night before that kind of compounded this like emotional stress going on in our lives with some stuff with family. I started that race, and in the first, and it climbs, I forget exactly, but the first maybe 20 miles of Bighorn are a pretty steady, long, consistent climb. And I've been climbing all summer in preparation for this, but what I didn't expect is at about mile, like I usually expect around maybe mile 50, things start like getting weird, like little like things start hurting that you weren't noticing before, or like that's where your mind really starts freaking out, whatever it is, or you like stomach starts to turn south, and that's when the problem solving really has to come out. But I didn't expect for that to happen at like mile 15. And so it was a super humbling experience to start climbing, and all of a sudden I was having like serious breathing issues, and I have never ever dealt with breathing. And the best way I could describe it is I felt like I was like my throat was starting to close off, like I was having like an asthma attack, but I don't have asthma. So it was really bizarre. But so my climbing started slowing, and I got to a point where I had to like pull over to the side of the trail and kind of like hunch over with my poles and breathe a little bit as people are passing me. And I remember it was such humble pie. There was a couple people that passed me that I recognized through social media connection. I've never met them in person, but we had followed each other for years or whatever. So again, like the ego side of me is telling me like, oh, so and so just watched me bend over on the side of the trail, and I should be way up at the front, whatever. Um, anyway, the end of that story was basically by mile 25, I had like somehow degraded and I could not breathe. My throat was completely closed off. And so I pulled over to the aid station. The medics pulled me in a tent. They forced me to stop so they could check to see what was going on, and couldn't really attribute it to like asthma or anything, but they gave me some allergy medicine, and I had to sit in the tent for an hour while they watched that, like, you know, to monitor, make sure everything was okay. But at that point, they cleared me to continue on if I chose to. And at that point, I'd been sitting for an hour. My body had been like, you know, my muscle, everything had just like slowed down and stopped. The last person had left that aid station maybe 30 minutes before, and it was pouring rain, and I was just shivering like crazy. And again, it's that mental, like the mental toughness ego side of me was telling me like, you should keep going. Like you do not DNF. Like you've never had a DNF. You're not a person that does that. But the reality of trying to not only continue on, but try to catch the back of the pack, and then also try to continue on in really remote territory, and possibly have to, you know, get like helicoptered out of there if things continue bad. So I made the call to DNF, and that was really disappointing at the time. Really, really hard for me to swallow that. The worst part about it, ironically, was not this feeling that I let myself down, because I actually felt very confident that I made the right call at the time based on what was going on. And you know, my husband like was supposed to meet me at mile 50 to start pacing me, so he had to come pick me up. So in those moments, it's pretty easy to be really honest and vulnerable. And I felt devastated at, you know, this unrealized utilization of all this fitness and time I invested into it. But the recurring thought in my head was more about like, what are other people going to think about me? Because they've been following along this whole time. They know that I'm doing this race. They know that I had these aggressive goals, and now what are people going to think about Kenzie Barlow that couldn't even make it past mile 25? And that was pretty humbling. And but that was the first time I had to really like sit and think about like, where is my identity in this sport? Like, because all of a sudden all the joy had been sucked out of it, like because I was so caught up in what other people were going to think when they found out that I had DNF'd. The good part of there is a good ending to the story, and it's that the good news was, because we never really chalked it up to anything. In hindsight, I look back and think I actually had a panic attack, which is really weird, but there was no asthma, no medical, anything that like could attribute to what was going on. So I think I had a panic attack. Well, but the good news was I recovered really quite well from that, because I had only run 25 miles. My body was prepared to go 100 miles. So when I got home, for 2 or 3 days, I was talking over these ideas with my husband, like this, like, oh my gosh, I feel like a failure, but it's like embarrassing to have to tell or like explain over and over to people why I quit, or to have to justify it to somebody else or whatever. And he was like, well, why don't you just go find another race? Like, see if you can find another race this weekend. If you feel like you're ready to go, and you know, you only went 25 miles, why don't you just sign up for something and go? And I'm like, nah, that sounds super vulnerable, because now what happens if I go sign up for that race and don't complete it? Like, then that's like a double negative. But I thought about it for a day, and I ended up just kind of like getting on ultra sign up and toying with the idea. And so I ended up completely out of character for me, because I'm very much a planner. And again, this kind of goes like to that coaching mentality. Like, I like to have my plans. This like Bighorn was like the epitome of everything's organized. I had like the elevation profile like printed out and laminated, so I could pick it up and see like, you know, exactly what I had at the next aid stations. Like, everything's planned out to a T. All of a sudden, I'm signing up for a race that I knew nothing about in Oregon. It's called the Old Cascadia 100. I had never even studied the course, nothing. All I knew was that it was a 100-mile race available that I could get into Wednesday, and the race was Saturday. So I signed up, kind of had a little bit of a freak out for a second, but then I decided I'm going to go out and I'm going to do this race, and I'm not going to tell anybody that I'm doing it. I'm just doing this for me, to prove to myself that I do have the ability to tough something out or whatever. And I'm just going to have whatever the experience is. If I end up DNFing, so what? Like, at least I'll know that I was brave enough to toe the start line again. And if I end up having a great race, then great, redeemed myself. I ended up having the most amazing experience of a race. It was the first time I've ever done a race without pacers or crew. I flew out there by myself. I packed some drop bags really quick. I didn't know anything about the course. I'm not saying that's the best way to go, but for me in this experience, I think it's exactly what I needed. And I ended up going out and running 100 miles completely by myself with nobody else to rely on besides me and my own head. And I ran a really strong race. I mean, I hit those highs like several times. It was a very surreal experience by the end. Like the last 5 miles, like I feel like I had completely transcended my body and it's floating, and it was just like everything finally came together, and like I was able to again have this experience without all of the negative like things that come from myself, but without like all the negative external pressures of like trying to prove something for someone else. So it was really great because I that was a huge confidence booster for me, and really going back to the question you had, which was how has this kind of shaped my identity as being like an ultra mountain person. I feel pretty comfortable saying I do feel like it's a huge part of me of like enhancing my life. um, I've been able to prove that to myself again through that experience. And there's been so many other times in life, and this is like one of the reasons why I love this sport so much for myself is that there's a lot of lessons that I've learned through these experiences that I feel like carry on to real life. And so, you know, there would be times where maybe I'm feeling, you know, like, oh, am I capable to handle some certain life situation or some sort of stressor? And like the reality is, a lot of our lives are about dealing with hard, stressful things and learning how to like see the big picture and just put your head down and grind. And I'm not trying to paint this bleak picture of life, but like there's so many highs and lows. And so being able to be a person that can intentionally step to the start line of something that I know is going to be crazy hard. There's no guarantees that I'm going to succeed in the goal when I start, but I'm brave enough to step up to the start line, and I believe in myself enough to know that I'm capable of doing it. And now I just have to put myself through the discomfort and see if I can come out on the other side. And through these experiences, both that I learned a lot. I actually learned more through that DNF at Bighorn about myself. It forced me to really like kind of get inside my head and think about what I love about this sport. But I was able to turn around and turn that into what was the most positive experience I've had so far through the sport, through doing that next race. So
I think that's such a valuable skill that every runner needs. You know, the this ability to take an example of adversity and turn it into something that you learn from, that you can turn into a positive experience. So it's just great to hear that you were able to turn things around. And, you know, I know, Kenzie, that you've written about being process oriented. And, you know, this just seems to me like such a great example of being process oriented. You know, like it probably wasn't in your best interest to try to run the last 75 miles of Bighorn because of all that you had dealt with that day. And while it was hard for your ego, it was probably the best process oriented decision that you could make on the day, even though it was such a hard decision to make
you're right.
under those
Yeah,
circumstances.
really good point. That's actually a really great way of putting it, for sure. So I
Yeah,
totally agree.
and it's funny too because I just talked to a performance psychology PhD 2 episodes ago on the
Yeah.
podcast, and I asked him what isn't mental toughness, and the first thing he said was mental toughness isn't grinding through an injury just to prove to yourself that you know you can finish a workout or a race. You know, that's the opposite. That is an ego driven poor decision. And
Yeah.
so hearing you like live this, you know, when, you know, and it's also a situation where you're dealing with all of these high emotions. It's not a purely logical decision. So that decision is much more difficult to make in the moment. And
Yeah.
so I think it's just wonderful that you were able to come to what it sounds like is the right decision.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with you. Um,
Now, Kenzie, I do want to talk about strength training. You mentioned it a little bit earlier. I have seen some videos of you on Instagram doing things that most mountain ultra endurance athletes would probably run away from faster than you could time with a fully automatic timing system.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about why you lift weights the way that you do, because I think so many other runners, particularly women, who are a little bit hesitant to get in the weight room, with the rest of the gym bros and flaunt their short shorts. So what would you say to those athletes?
Oh gosh. I think it just goes back to like being willing to put yourself in an uncomfortable position at first, but acknowledging that you don't always have to stay in that place. And I actually started weight training a little bit before I started running, so it was already kind of part of my background. Maybe not nearly to the degree that I do it now, but I've become more comfortable and definitely more skilled in the types of lifting that I like to do. But I would definitely attribute being, I mean, again, let's like set aside my back. It's an unfortunate and very frustrating thing that I don't know that I'll ever be able to change, but I can definitely learn how to train around that or train with that in mind. And I think strength training that's a huge motivator for me. Being able to keep a strong frame helps me keep good form. It's having like really good muscular endurance is beneficial for me. Again, when we're talking about really technical mountain ascents or descents and things like that. So I found a lot of value in it. As far as what I do, is that the question?
I think I'm interested in some of the reasons why you do it, and some of the reasons I'd love to hear more about your response to many of the common reasons that runners don't get in the weight room. Like, this is scary to me. This isn't my comfort zone.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, Lifting heavy weight is not something I do as an endurance runner. I'm
Yeah.
going to get bulky. I mean,
Okay.
you are an ultra endurance mountain athlete who lifts heavy weights. Why do you need to lift heavy weights in the first place? Do you really need all that strength?
Okay. Need, do I absolutely need it? No. Could I do okay without it? Sure. Um, gosh, what a polarizing topic, right? I think
I know
I
I'm
would think I
wading
would
into a
start with
minefield right now.
maybe the common comments or um, critics, I guess, of why I do what I do would be a couple things. Like one, um, I think one of the critic comments would be, well, if you're super bulky, then that's just going to slow you down. Um, and again, like, well, okay, so there's that, and then there's also I've had several running coaches who are against strength running or strength training, and maybe their comment is, well, if you have the time and energy to invest in more training, you should be doing more running, like adding more running, more volume, I guess, to your schedule versus putting that time into the gym. Um, I think my answer to that is a couple things. I'm a huge proponent, obviously, of strength training. Again, I feel like um, running is such a unilateral movement and it's really repetitive. It's the same thing over and over. And a lot of people that just come into running, it's pretty easy for anybody, even the most uncoordinated person, to go out and run down the road. There's not a lot to it, but if you don't have good form or you have a lot of uneven deficiencies, things like that, that's when like these weird little injuries start to come up. So I like it, especially for mountain runners, but even I know like even in the road running marathoning world, I like it even just for the idea of the prehab, the benefits that it has. Like, so there's almost every single person out there has one side of their body that's stronger than the other. Like somebody favors one leg when they kick, and so that's naturally a stronger leg. So if you think of how many times you're repeating the same movement over and over, and you have one side that's stronger than the other, and you're not focusing on isolating and strengthening both sides of those, then that's going to be what I would call a fitness limiter, or it's going to be unrealized potential that you have. So I chose to do it. I mean, again, I started doing it mainly, to be honest, because I just liked it. But then when I started getting more serious about my running goals, and I had to start kind of choosing like being more strategic. Is this what's beneficial to me? I found again in those earlier times, I really excelled when it came to like, mile 50 when people's quads are just totally blown out because of all the descending that you've been doing, where I feel like my muscular endurance was so well, my body was so well set up to withstand the same repetitive movements over and over. And so where people were dealing with muscle breakdown over time on certain things, that was never my limiter. I didn't ever feel like if I had a limiter, it would be whatever it was, like stomach or aerobic, like the engine maybe, but never to me structurally. I've always been really proud of that for myself, um, and so I've chose to maintain that.
Sounds amazing. My limiter has always been structural problems rather than my engine. So I'm a little envious,
We can
Kenzie.
combine forces and make
I
moan.
know, with our powers combined.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, Kenzie, thank you for this really interesting conversation. I've really enjoyed learning about, how you got into this sport and what keeps you going in this sport despite some of the adversity that you've experienced. And hearing your perspectives on all that, I think is really inspiring for not just the listeners, but for me. I'm ready to go run through a wall right now. I'm feeling
Thank
great.
you. Grab that pre-workout. Let's go.
Yeah. So what's next for you, Kenzie? Do you have a race on the schedule right now?
Um, I do. I'm currently signed up for the Crazy Mountain 100. So that's it's a newer race in Montana. I'm super excited about it because it just looks really wild and rugged and remote, and that's like seems to be my jam. We'll see how that goes with the back training stuff. My little sister actually is running her first 100 miler this year, and so um, I have, I have a lot of vested interest in making sure that her experience is great for that. So I plan to, if things don't go well for me with this 100 miler, then I'll probably do what I love to do is adventure runs. We've got the Grand Canyon rim to rim to rim on the schedule. My husband and I love to travel and run wherever we go. And so we've got a couple of things on the docket, including Ireland when we go back. Some goals we have, some running goals, and some routes out there that we want to explore. And so, yeah, just doing my best to take what's given and maximize what I can out of it, and just be grateful and enjoy the process.
They're not even trying to hide like the difficulty of these races anymore with the names. What is the
No,
crazy mountain
Crazy
race? I
Mountains.
mean,
Apparently, the Crazy Mountains is actually the name of the range, from what I understand. Which is I've never heard of them. They're outside of Bozeman, but you definitely when you hear Crazy Mountain, you're like, ooh, that sounds kind of nuts. But or like Rhinestone or Hard Rock, whatever they are. But yeah, you tell people you're doing them, they're like, what's wrong with you? Why are you
meanwhile, you're
doing this?
racing to sign up for these races.
Yeah, yeah. So there, that goes back into that. Maybe I'm a little not normal, but I've definitely learned to embrace that, and am actually quite proud of it.
I love it. Well, I'm sure people can follow along with your adventures on your Instagram page. Your handle is hilariously sarcasm in spandex, and I'll include a link to that in the show notes.
Thank you.
Is there anywhere else people should go to learn more about you, your career, keep up with all the fun things you're doing?
Um, I'm for how much for how much I'm on Instagram, I'm kind of like a one trick pony. That's where you'll find me. I mean, I have a link to like I have a website that I keep up. I'm not the best at updating it, but you can definitely find me there. There's ways that you can contact me through email through there. But I have like a link tree I think set up on my Instagram bio, so that's a great place to start.
Sarcasm in spandex. Kenzie, thanks so much for being here. I
You're
appreciate
very
it.
welcome. What a pleasure. Good talking with you.